Hey there, amazing friends. I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. The horse carriage lost in the mist, the enigmatic passenger on the cemetery road out of time. A pale moon hung low in the sky as thick fog drifted across the old cemetery road, shrouding the distant trees and tombstones in a veiled glow. The hush of an autumn night enveloped the countryside, broken only by faint winds gusts stirring branches. Night creatures, owls and foxes, kept their distance from that lonely path, for local legend whispered that strange occurrences took place there, especially under a dim moon. If one walked the road at twilight, they might sense an unearthly presence trailing them, as though the air itself trembled with anticipation of an event forever replaying in that place. Over the generations, villagers spoke in hushed tones of ghostly sightings, a horse-drawn carriage appearing without warning in the swirling mist, its driver silent and its form half concealed by the drifting white gloom. Some travelers claim to have spotted a solitary passenger as well, clad in old-fashioned garb, perched behind the driver, an enigmatic figure who never turned, never spoke, but exuded an aura of sorrow or longing. No matter how often the phenomenon repeated, the carriage would vanish as abruptly as it arrived, leaving behind only the faint echo of hooves on damp earth. For many, it was nothing but a local ghost story, an old wives' tale meant to keep curious youths from roaming the cemetery road at night. For others, particularly those who had witnessed the event at close range, it was an unsolved puzzle that hovered over the region like a tapestry of unspoken dread. Late one autumn, a newcomer named Lucien arrived in the village. He was a researcher of paranormal occurrences and regional folklore, having spent years traveling across different continents to document unexplained phenomena. Upon hearing about this ghostly horse carriage lost in the mist, Lucien's curiosity flared. He rented a small cottage near the village edge and began making discreet inquiries with the townsfolk. Initially, they offered him uncertain shrugs. Some didn't want to talk. Others dismissed the tale as a myth. But after a few nights drinking at the local tavern, forging hesitant friendships, Lucien gleaned a pattern of testimonies that matched. People indeed had encountered the carriage at specific times, usually on fog-laden nights near the old cemetery. The sightings stretched back decades, even centuries, with the earliest known mention in parish records from the 1700s describing an apparition of a coach upon the burying road. However, no one could pinpoint who the passenger was or why the phenomenon persisted. Now it fell to Lucien to see if he could unravel the mystery, or at least witness it himself. Cemetery Road snaked through hilly farmland before plunging into a narrow valley lined with cypress trees, culminating in a wrought iron gate that opened onto an old burial ground. Tombstones, some crumbling with age, dotted a gentle slope beyond that gate. By day, the place was melancholic but benign. By night, the mist rolled in from the valley, cloaking the road in swirling white. The carriage typically appeared along a stretch just before the cemetery entrance, according to those who had glimpsed it. Some watchers claimed it crossed the threshold into the graveyard itself, though few dared follow to confirm. Lucien resolved to stake out the site for multiple nights, equipped with cameras, an audio recorder, a small thermal imaging device, and a keen sense of caution. He reasoned that if the phenomenon was real, consistent observation might eventually produce results, footage, or direct confrontation. Yet deep down, even he felt a twinge of dread, suspecting that the local folklore about ghostly carriage sightings was only half the story. On his first night out, Lucien arrived at twilight, parking his car discreetly off the road near a cluster of trees. He hiked up a short slope to a vantage point from which he could watch the roads curve leading to the cemetery gates. Already an evening chill set in, accentuating the creeping fog that trailed through the hollows. He set up a tripod with his camera, checking angles by the faint glow of a handheld lantern. Crickets chirped softly in the underbrush, but as the sun's final rays faded, a hush crept in, as though nature itself had gone on alert. Hours slipped by with no event, just the slow swirl of mist thickening. Lucien felt the sting of cold seep into his bones. He began to wonder if he was chasing illusions. Then around midnight, a shift in the atmosphere drew his attention. The air grew strangely still. Even the typical rustle of leaves paused, as though awaiting something. He strained his eyes through the haze and glimpsed a faint glow, as if a lantern bobbed at a distance down the road. At first, he assumed it might be a late traveler or a caretaker from the cemetery. But the glow advanced steadily, accompanied by a soft clop of hooves. Lucien's heart jumped. Could it be? He grabbed his camera, hitting record. The glow took shape, revealing itself as an old-fashioned carriage lamp swaying on a horse-drawn vehicle. The silhouette emerged from the gloom, 2 horses, dark-coated, pulling a modest carriage with spoked wheels. The driver perched high, wearing a cloak or wide-brimmed hat. The passenger, from Lucien's vantage, was only a vague figure leaning in the back seat. The entire ensemble seemed translucent at the edges, or perhaps it was the thickness of the fog. Without question, though, the carriage looked archaic, out of place in the modern era. It advanced at a calm pace, the hooves nearly silent upon the damp road, the wheels not making the typical rattling noise one would expect. Lucien's pulse soared. He pressed the zoom on his camera, capturing as best he could. The carriage was now maybe 40 or 50 yards away from his vantage, approaching the cemetery gates. Then, as he tried to readjust focus, the entire apparition flickered like a candle flame about to be snuffed out. He heard a whispered moan, or perhaps the wind, and in that moment, the carriage vanished, blinked out, leaving only swirling mist behind. The entire experience, from first sight to disappearance, lasted less than a minute. Excitement and confusion wrestled in Lucien's mind. He reviewed his camera screen, but the footage showed mostly swirling fog and a faint shape of a light with minimal detail. It might not suffice to convince skeptics. Yet for him, the experience was transformative. He had seen a genuine paranormal event. Over the next hour, he lingered, hoping the carriage might reappear, but it did not. At dawn, he trudged back to his cottage, replaying the scene in his head. Over the following day, he sought out older villagers, gently describing what had witnessed. Some smirked with resigned acceptance, as if it was inevitable that an outsider would discover the phenomenon eventually. Others gave him cryptic warnings. Don't try to board that carriage, or you'll vanish from this time. Or the passenger is said to be outside of life and death, searching for something or someone. Another rumor that if you followed the carriage into the cemetery, you might cross into a realm from which you never return. Lucien, hungry for more data, decided to continue nightly vigils. On the second night, the carriage didn't appear, nor the third. But on the fourth, around 2 a.m., while he was half dozing in a canvas chair near the road, he heard the hooves again, this time from behind him. He spun around, only to see the carriage rolling by at unnaturally close range. The horse's eyes shone with a ghostly luminescence, and the driver seemed not to notice him at all. Heart racing, Lucien tried to record video, but the device jammed or malfunctioned. A feeling of intense cold enveloped him, and for a fleeting second, he locked eyes with the passenger. The figure wore a wide hood or veil, making the face obscure, but from the pale outline of features, he sensed a haunting sadness. Then, as quickly as it had come, the carriage glided forward into the thicker mist, and vanished near the same location as before. Left behind was a swirl of unsettled air and a faint echo reminiscent of a sigh. This time, the swirling rumor about a passenger with sorrowful eyes had proved real to him. The watchers in the village insisted that passenger was always present, though few got a direct look. Some speculated it was the carriage owner's deceased spouse or child, or a lost traveler forever trapped in limbo. The consistent detail was that no one saw the passenger move or speak, yet their presence saturated the environment with melancholic tension. In the following days, Lucien sought more historical clues. He discovered that the property near the cemetery, once owned by a reclusive noble family, had lost a beloved daughter to illness or tragic accident. The father, grief-stricken, commissioned a carriage to transport her coffin to the cemetery, but local rumor states the coffin never arrived. The family refused to elaborate, and soon after, the entire lineage died out or moved away. Another story from a local archivist mentioned a time rift. A traveling merchant in the early 19th century claimed he was overtaken on the road by a horse carriage from a previous century, whose driver spoke in archaic dialect. By the time the merchant realized the peculiarity, the carriage had vanished. Over centuries, every few decades or so, the sightings repeated. This continuity across time added a new dimension of spookiness. The phenomenon was not just a ghost, but a recurring loop of events locked in eternal midnight, perhaps bridging epochs. Some watchers insisted that if you managed to intercept the carriage physically, you might slip into that older time or dimension. But no known living soul had ever done so and returned to speak of it. Emboldened, Lucien planned a more direct approach. He would wait near the cemetery gates, precisely at the hour the carriage usually manifested, and attempt to hail the driver. If the driver slowed or responded, maybe he could glean some clue, though the risk was monumental. He arranged a small campsite behind a row of yew trees, out of direct sight, with a vantage of the road. The night was starless, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. Fog drifted thicker than usual, so clammy that it clung to his jacket. He waited for hours, hearing only the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, around midnight, the familiar hush swept the area. No winds, no animals, a silence that magnified each breath. His pulse quickened as he recognized the preceding sign. Sure enough, the faint glow of a carriage lantern materialized down the road, accompanied by the subdued clop of hooves. He mustered his courage, stepping from his hiding place, flashlight off to avoid spooking the apparition. The carriage drew nearer, the driver's silhouette merging with the gloom. Summoning nerve, Lucien stepped onto the road, lifting a hand. "Hello," he called. The carriage did not slow. The driver's face remained hidden under a broad-brimmed hat, and the passenger sat behind, half lost in swirling mist. Driven by adrenaline, Lucien darted forward, hoping to place a hand on the carriage's side. A wave of cold overcame him, and the shape of the carriage's body felt intangible or ephemeral, like running into a heavy swirl of water rather than solid wood. He staggered, almost passing through the shape. For a split second, he glimpsed the passenger's face, a pale visage with large, sorrowful eyes, mouth parted in an expression of endless yearning. Then everything flickered, and the carriage moved past him, continuing along the road toward the cemetery gates. Dizziness swamped Lucien, a sense of dislocation, as if space and time had momentarily rearranged themselves. When his vision cleared, the carriage was gone. Not even the sound of hooves remained. He found himself on the cemetery side of the road, near the gate, though he had no memory of crossing the entire distance. Shaken, he realized he might have momentarily merged with the ghostly realm. He was unharmed, though disoriented, kneeling among gravestones. Gathering breath, he retreated to his campsite, numb from the experience. That night, nightmares plagued him, swirling images of an 18th century funeral, a casket never delivered, a sorrowful figure trapped within a carriage that roamed dark roads for centuries. The following morning, he resolved to investigate the graves within the cemetery to see if any mention of the carriage or the passenger might appear on tombstones or funeral records. He spent the day combing the old headstones. Many were too worn to read, but in a far corner, he found a half-sunken slab bearing the name Eleonora Halvest, beloved daughter, 1713-1728. The date matched a period rumored for carriage sightings. A local caretaker, an old man, approached, remarking that people claimed Eleonora's spirit roamed those grounds. He also mentioned an old story that her father's last attempt to bury her at night ended in some calamity, leaving the coffin and carriage lost to the mists. Could be that the father's despair or some unholy pact bound Eleonora's soul, the caretaker said softly. They say the father died soon after, cursing the road with his final breath. This lined up eerily well with what Lucien had gleaned. Torn between fear and curiosity, Lucien decided he would attempt one final direct confrontation on the next foggy night. This time, he would stand in the road's center, unwavering, forcing the carriage either to stop or pass through him. If it truly had the power to hurt him, so be it. If not, maybe he could glean the passenger's identity or intentions. So on the third night after that, conditions were perfect. Heavy mist, low moon. Lucien positioned himself at the same location, prepared with a small voice recorder. The hush came around midnight, and the faint lamp glow soon emerged. The carriage approached at its typical, unhurried pace. The driver remained a featureless silhouette. The passenger, though veiled by mist, seemed more distinct, like a figure in a tattered dress, hands clasped in her lap. Lucien steadied his breath, heart hammering, and stood dead center in the road, arms spread. The carriage drew closer, not slowing. As it neared contact, a wave of intense cold struck him. He braced, half expecting to pass through it. Instead, time seemed to slow. He heard the hooves more sharply, the creak of ancient wheels. He saw every detail of the horse's harness in that suspended moment. The passenger's gaze turned toward him. For a fraction of a second, their eyes locked. The sorrow in her expression was staggering, as if an entire eternity of mourning lay behind those eyes. Then a single moan escaped her lips, an anguished whisper that seemed to speak to him directly, though he couldn't parse words. At that moment, everything blurred. He lost his sense of orientation. The next thing he knew, the carriage had slid past, continuing along its path. He remained upright, gasping, drenched in sweat, despite the chill air. The carriage, once again, vanished near the cemetery gate, leaving him alone in the swirling mist. Collapsing to his knees, Lucien felt tears on his cheeks, though he couldn't say why, except that the passenger's gaze had conveyed a heartbreak so profound it cracked his composure. In that ephemeral exchange, he sensed a longing for release, a desperation to communicate something. So perhaps the ghostly passenger's endless journey was a plea for someone to break the cycle, to free her from the loop of traveling that lonely road. But how? The next day, he conferred with the caretaker who had told him of Eleonora Halvest. They speculated that if the passenger was indeed Eleonora, her remains might never have been properly interred. The caretaker recounted old local legend that the father had tried to bury her in secret, some say to hide signs of plague or unnatural cause of death, but the carriage was lost in the mist, never reaching the grave. The caretaker believed that if one found the hidden casket or remnants of the father's old ledger, they might conduct a proper burial in hallowed ground, dissolving the spiritual tether. Lucien, though fearful, saw a path forward. Over the next days, with the caretaker's help, he scoured the outer edges of the cemetery, checking half-collapsed crypts and overgrown corners. They found no direct sign of a casket, but they discovered an unmarked vault entrance, half buried beneath vines. Inside, just a small stone chamber, mostly empty, except a single broken coffin that seemed never used, covered in dust. Not Eleonora's. So possibly the casket was lost somewhere along the road or in adjacent farmland. Undeterred, Lucien and a few local volunteers formed a small search party, scanning the roadside with metal detectors and rods. This spanned weeks, tested their patience. The watchers in the village remained wary. But eventually, they stumbled upon a patch of ground in the forest near the road's final bend that indicated some sort of shallow structure. Excavating carefully, they uncovered a partially rotted wooden box. Inside lay remnants of a child-sized coffin, the interior lined with scraps of decayed cloth. No bones remained. Likely, the remains had been scattered or disintegrated by time. Yet, the presence of that coffin, adorned with a partial nameplate reading Eleno, left little doubt. They performed a respectful ritual, exhuming the fragments, transferring them to a small modern container. The caretaker then helped arrange a quiet reburial in the official cemetery, reading blessings in the hope it would lay the spirit to rest at last. For a moment, it seemed a gentle hush fell over the entire cemetery as they lowered the container into the earth, as though the land exhaled relief. Lucien felt a sense of closure wash over him. If the ghostly passenger was truly Eleonora, perhaps now the loop would end. The caretaker uttered a final prayer, sealing the grave with fresh soil. That night, Lucien lingered near the road, anxious to see if the carriage would appear, or if the phenomenon had truly ceased. Midnight came and went, yet no sound of hooves, no spectral lamp glow, no swirl of unnatural chill. The silence was absolute. Relief flooded him, though a small part of him felt a pang of sorrow for the finality of it. Over the next few nights, the village lay quiet, with no new sightings reported. Locals who had grown used to the dreaded rumor realized that the hush signaled a positive shift, like a long lingering shadow had receded. Some approached Lucien to thank him for removing the house's old burden or freeing a tortured spirit. Others remained skeptical that the ghostly carriage had ever existed. But the watchers who had seen or heard it recognized the significance of that quiet. The road near the cemetery no longer felt oppressive after dusk. The caretaker confided that, in dreams, he sensed a young child's voice offering gratitude, though it might have been his own imagination. Lucien, for his part, prepared to continue his travels, feeling both satisfied and oddly changed by the experience. The line between folklore and tangible haunting had blurred in front of him, forging a memory that would guide his future investigations with deeper empathy. On his final evening in the region, he strolled one last time along the cemetery road at dusk. The air was calm, the sky painted with gentle purple hues. Mist still gathered, but it lacked the menacing edge. Stopping by the cemetery gates, he cast a glance at the moon overhead, half expecting a lamp's glimmer to emerge. None came. He whispered a soft farewell, acknowledging that the spirit and the driver, if they were indeed real, had presumably found their rest or had concluded their endless loop. The sense of resolution was palpable. In a flash of memory, he recalled that fleeting moment locked in the passenger's gaze, an ocean of heartbreak in those eyes. Now, that heartbreak might finally be at peace. Thus, the saga of the horse carriage lost in the mist, the enigmatic passenger on the cemetery road out of time, concludes with a note of bittersweet hope, an instance where confronting the haunting and honoring the tragedy behind it perhaps severed the spectral chain. The road continues to meander through farmland to the quiet gates of the cemetery, but the nights remain tranquil, with no echo of hooves or phantom screams, at least for now. Some might say that one day the loop could reawaken if some new traveler disturbs the spirit's resting place, or if cosmic forces realign. But for the current generation of villagers, a veil of peace has replaced the old fear, and they can walk that road at twilight without seeing the swirl of a ghostly carriage vanish into the mist. For Lucian and all who crave to discover hidden truths in old legends, this stands as a testament that sometimes, behind a spectral phenomenon, lies a longing soul, waiting only for someone to unravel its sorrow and offer it the closure that a lonely century of restless wandering denied it. And maybe, in that final hush of midnight, where the moor breathes softly and no carriage emerges from the swirling light, the passenger truly rests at last, free from the endless journey.